As any good salesman knows, there's certain sales techniques you can use to sell folks stuff they don't really need and may not even want. You can learn these techniques on the job, you can study them in college, and you can learn them out of books. And you can use them to sell used cars, snake oil, or even whole entire deities. But that last one kind of raises a question. Why would a genuine, honest-to-goodness God need folks to use salesmanship to sell folks on the idea that he even exists? Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And even though the book is entitled Tactics, plural, we's almost halfway through it, and he's still only discussed one tactic, namely the Columbo tactic of asking other folks questions instead of sharing your own views. And I think that says something significant. Here's Dr. Greg Koukl, professional apologist, founder of the Stand to Reason Apologetics Ministry, and the primary focus of his apologetic method is avoiding or postponing an honest declaration of what he believes. That's a defensive strategy, a strategy of digging foxholes and trenches in order to hide from the enemy, entirely unlike any New Testament story about Christians sharing their faith. And I think there's a good reason for that. In the New Testament stories, God was supposedly present and involved in the spread of the gospel, and Christians could afford to be bold in their testimony because the stories say God was backing them up. But real life ain't like the stories. God is so notoriously absent from the daily experience of ordinary folks that his absence has a formal name, the problem of divine hiddenness. And that means that New Testament-style techniques that rely on God being active and involved ain't going to work in real life the way they do in the stories. Greg may be at the forefront of apologists realizing that they needs to adapt their approach to something more compatible with a modern, godless world. And that means avoiding sharing your testimony for as long as possible while you sneakily probe the other person's opinions looking for a tactical vulnerability you can exploit. Or in other words, you need the Columbo tactic. And at the risk of belaboring the obvious, a real God ought to have better evidence than that. Heck, a real God shouldn't need apologists at all. The very fact that Greg Koukl thought it necessary to devote the first half of his book to techniques for avoiding any mention of your faith is exactly the outcome we would expect if in the Christian God is just a myth that believers exploit to their own benefit. Anyways, let's get into Chapter 8, shall we? The title of the book is Perfecting Columbo. And just like with the earlier chapters, there's a mix of good advice and bad advice along with some examples we can use to prepare ourselves in case some eager Columbo wannabe latches on to us. So let's dig in. He starts off by emphasizing the importance of the Columbo tactic. Quote, "We have spent quite a bit of time focusing on a single tactic. I have taken this time because Columbo is so important. It is central to every tactic that follows." End quote. And like I just got done saying, that's consistent with a mythical God who can't show up in real life to reinforce your testimony. It's all up to human effort and human skill, which is why believers has to learn how to use special tactics in the first place. Greg goes on to take 3 or 4 paragraphs to basically say, practice makes perfect. As with all human endeavors, if you want to get good at convincing folks, you need to work hard to perfect your technique. The more effort you put into your own training, the more likely you are to get results that you can give God credit for, even though it was really you that done all the work. Greg recommends 2 times when you're going to have your best opportunity to prepare: before the conversation starts and after the conversation is over. And this is fairly common sense advice. Think about what you're going to say and what the other person might say in response so as you can have a glib answer ready. And then after the conversation, think about what you said and how you might have done it better. This is advice that you can get in pretty much any salesmanship class. He's basically preparing to sell God the same way you'd sell a used car. Sharpen your sales pitch, try and make the sale, and then review your performance so as you can try and do better on the next one. And this is an approach that works whether you're selling cars or gods or cryptocurrency or whatever else. It's based on understanding human psychology and exploiting human weaknesses with a feedback loop so you can improve your success rate as you go. Our entire economy is based on the fact that this stuff does indeed work, and work well. From a purely evangelistic standpoint, then, this is good advice, or at least effective advice. He's going to achieve some amount of success even without any help from God, and then you can give God credit for your success and reinforce your own faith whether God exists or not. But now it's example time. And to illustrate the principle of being prepared for what the other person is going to say, Greg uses his debate with Michael Shermer. Quote, "In my national radio debate with atheist and Skeptic magazine founder Michael Shermer, I knew he was going to ask me who created God because Shermer always asks it in debates. I've done my homework, even though he should know better." End quote. Since he was pretty sure what Shermer was going to ask, he was able to craft a ready-made reply in response. Quote, "Here's what I said. Michael, you don't believe God was created because you don't believe in God. I don't believe God was created because I believe God is eternal. Nobody in this conversation believes God was created. So why are you asking me who created God?" End quote. That's quite the purty little zinger, ain't it? This is why I say it's better to make a simple, non-confrontational declarative statement than to ask an apologist a gotcha question. I'm sure Shermer had a good answer to Greg's question, and of course Greg ain't going to mention what that was, but I still think Shermer would have been a lot better off just saying something like this. Creationists and intelligent design advocates like to claim that complex things require an even more complex creator. Yet God, if he existed, would be the most complex thing of all. That means creationists ought to believe that God himself requires a more complex creator, and yet they don't. They believe that God, the most complex thing imaginable, exists without needing a creator. And this shows that even Christians know that it's possible for complex things to exist just because they exist, as a brute fact, without a creator. And if it's possible for complex things to exist without a more complex creator, Occam's razor tells us that it's simpler if the universe itself is the complex thing that exists just because it exists. And therefore the uncreated universe is more likely to be true. Now, if Greg tries to reply to that, he's going to be stuck, because if he says the universe needs a creator but God don't, he's committing a special pleading fallacy. Which, okay, he's probably going to do that anyway, but it just ain't going to have the same zing. And that's why I say that even in a debate, it's usually better to make a forthright statement than to ask a gotcha question. Under the heading of Learning from Your Mistakes, Greg tells a story of a time he was preaching a sermon on how to use the Columbo tactic, and after the sermon he went to stand by the exit to greet folks as they left to go home. But as he got to the exit, something happened. Quote, "A young lady was already there waiting for me, hand extended. 'I'm a Christian,' she announced, 'and a Buddhist and a pagan.' 'Well, it sounds to me like you don't know very much about those religions,' I shot back." End quote. Whoops. Greg accidentally gave her an honest, straightforward declaration of his beliefs instead of asking a question, and he'd insulted her intelligence besides. And here he'd just got done preaching a sermon on using the Columbo tactic. Well, everybody has an off day and sometimes gets caught with their drawers down, but he quickly recovered his fumble and asked her what Jesus would have said about her beliefs. And unfortunately for Greg, she said she thought Jesus would be fine with her beliefs, and just then the rest of the congregation showed up to shake his hand, and off she went, and, well, that was the end of that. Quote, "It wasn't until my self-assessment time later that I'd thought of a second question I might have asked if I'd had one more shot. Can you show me in the Gospels any specific thing Jesus said that would give you the impression he'd be okay with somebody saying they were a Christian and a Buddhist and a pagan?" End quote. Which, in its way, is a question that's every bit as smug and patronizing as the insult he'd blurted out at the start of his conversation. But he don't know that, or at least he don't recognize it. And of course, if he had asked her that question, she'd have been within her rights to point out that Jesus didn't write the Gospels, and whoever did write them decades later didn't write down everything Jesus said, so she'd still have room to wiggle out of his gotcha, and I doubt Greg would have had a good answer. Of course, I don't think many skeptics would ever claim to be pagan Buddhist Christians, but there's still something that we can learn from this exchange, and that is that folks don't let their religion dictate their beliefs. They pick and choose from religion whatever reinforces what they already want to believe, and that becomes their religion. Even Christians like Greg do that. The New Testament says lots more about caring for the sick and the poor and the elderly than it does about persecuting gay folks, but you won't hear Greg advocating for universal health care and welfare programs the way he goes after legislation to deny equal rights to gay folks. He picks and chooses the parts of his religion that reinforces his own beliefs and values, no matter what Jesus said or didn't say. Greg's next reminiscence harkens back to a story he told in Chapter 3 about his conversation with an animal rights activist. Apparently, as he was leaving the get-together, he asked her one last question. "What do you think about abortion?" Just the perfect topic to bring up on your way out the door. At least, if and use a troll. Well, she replied that she supported it because she didn't believe in bringing unwanted children into the world, and at the time, Greg couldn't think of a snappy comeback, so he just finished saying his goodbyes and left. Later on, though, he tried to imagine a good gotcha question he could have used on her. Quote, "Not wanting to bring unwanted children into the world may be a legitimate reason for contraception, but it has nothing to do with abortion. When a woman is pregnant, the child is already in the world. This weakness could be exploited with a question. I could have responded to her comment by asking, 'Do you think unwanted children ought to be allowed to stay in the world?'" End quote. So 2 things to notice here. One is the binary thinking involved in assuming that a quote-unquote child is either 100% present in the world or 100% absent. Greg ain't leaving no room for the biological reality of incremental development. If any part of the organism is present, in Greg's mind, the entire organism is already present. And that just ain't reality. Second, by equating abortion with infanticide, Greg is misstating the issue. The goal of ending a pregnancy is to protect the woman's bodily autonomy, not to kill nobody. The reason an embryo dies after abortion is because it's biologically incomplete. It ain't completed its natural development yet and is therefore something less than a person. But more importantly, neither unwanted children nor even wanted children have any right to be inside another person's body consuming their resources without that other person's consent. That's what bodily autonomy means. Forcing a woman to carry an unwanted pregnancy is a violent sexual assault, and she is 100% justified in ending that sexual assault by any means necessary. And I ain't saying that the embryo is the one assaulting her, since the embryo ain't even a person yet. The sexual predators in this case is the folks that's threatening the woman with prison and or the death penalty if and she exercises her rights. That kind of coercion is violent sexual assault, and she has a right to defend herself against it. And questions about infanticide is entirely irrelevant. For his final example, Greg recalls a time he responded to a question about homosexuality by quoting several Bible verses against it. The student he was talking to shut him down by saying, "People twist the scriptures all the time," which completely pulled the rug out from under him. He'd expected the supposed authority of the Bible to be the final word in the debate, but the student instead focused on the fallibility of men interpreting the Bible, and Greg didn't have a good answer for that one. And spoiler alert, he still don't. The Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura produces a theological no man's land where every believer believes whatever interpretation is right in their own eyes, and there ain't no objective standard that 2 parties can use that both will accept as settling the question of who's right and who's wrong. Folks is just going to believe what they want to believe and interpret the Bible however they think it ought to be interpreted. But say what you like about Greg, he's persistent. He thought about his conversation with the student, and he thought about it some more, and finally come up with a response. Quote, "Suddenly it dawned on me. The student's point wasn't really that some people twist the Bible. His point was that I was twisting the Bible. Yet he hadn't demonstrated that. He had not shown where I had gotten off track with the passage that I'd used to address his concerns." End quote. And at this point, Greg goes off onto a long, self-affirming fantasy in which he challenges the student to prove him wrong, and the student can't, and all's right with the world again. And to be fair, Greg does have a lot going for him here, because it's true that there's lots of frankly homophobic verses in the Bible, and you can't get around that just by saying that folks is twisting the scriptures. Instead, the student might be better off bringing up divorce. In Deuteronomy 24 verse 1, it says that if a man wants to divorce his wife, he should give her a certificate of divorce and send her out of his house. However, in Matthew 19:8, Jesus basically says that ain't how it's supposed to be. It's in the Bible, but it ain't right. It's only there because of the hardness of men's hearts. And that's an important principle, because it means we can't just take the scripture's word for things. Some things is there just because of the hardness of men's hearts. And we can make the case that homophobic passages is one of those situations on account of the fact that the Trinity is a union of three male persons. And that means the Trinitarian God is literally a same-sex union, and a same-sex union ain't going to create a moral law that condemns same-sex unions as if they was something corrupt and unclean. The homophobic scriptures is obviously and undeniably the product of hardened and bigoted human hearts, and not a genuine divine decree. Now, this is something that should be said calmly and non-confrontationally, because it's going to be a lot for the believer to digest in one go. They's going to want to accuse you of making a gross and disgusting accusation against God, so you need to make it clear that you ain't talking about any kind of physical intimacy. You're just pointing out the implications of what Christians has been teaching since the 4th century. A heterosexual union is only a union metaphorically and symbolically. The man and the woman don't literally become one single being, but the Father, Son, and Spirit is supposed to literally be one God, and that's a literal union between three male persons. A God like that ain't going to be homophobic about same-sex unions, because he is one. And just leave him to think about that one, because that's going to give him plenty to think about. Greg closes chapter 8 with some advice that's actually pretty good. Quote, "The style you adopt in any conversation will depend on your goal. Do you want to persuade the other person, or do you want to refute him?" End quote. According to Greg, if you want to persuade the other person, you're supposed to use the questions that Greg thinks is innocent and inoffensive. But if there's an audience present and you don't think you can easily persuade the other person, you can get more hardcore with your gotcha questions. And that's fairly close to my own strategy in not using any questions at all if and using a one-on-one conversation with a believer. The friendliest and least confrontational approach is to simply state, this is what I believe, and these are the reasons I believe it, and this is what I don't believe, and here's my reasons for not believing. You ain't accusing nor insulting nobody, you's just stating the facts about your own state of mind. And I think most folks will respect your honesty even if they disagrees with you. If and they's an audience, though, and the person you's talking to is trying to lead folks astray, sometimes it's okay to be more aggressive and confrontational. But even here, I think you can make a bigger impact by having a calm demeanor and a well-thought-out answer, stated clearly and non-confrontationally. But then again, maybe that's just my personal style. And that's going to wrap it up for Chapter 8. Glory, glory, hallelujah, I think Greg is finally done presenting his Columbo tactic, at least as far as explaining what it is and how to use it. I'm sure we'll still be hearing lots more about it since, like Greg says, it's the core of his evangelistic approach. But I gotta say, now that we got a good look at what it really is, I'm underwhelmed. At various points in my life, I've been on Usenet News, and I've had a blog with lots of commenters, and I've been on social media, and, well, long story short, I've seen lots of internet trolls pulling the I'm just asking questions gambit. And that style of implausible deniability is a key component of the Columbo method, as Greg has mentioned repeatedly. And I gotta ask, would a real God need an army of trolls out trolling for Jesus like that? Seems to me like a real God would have bolder and more forthright testimonies, and he'd back them up with his miraculous power so his evangelists wouldn't end up all embarrassed and defensive. Meanwhile, on the other hand, trolling and hiding behind questions and using the Columbo tactic is just the kind of approach we'd expect to see believers using in the absence of any real God. So there's that. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to start Chapter 9 entitled Turnabout, Defending Against Columbo. Because no matter how friendly and respectful and courteous Greg says his Columbo tactic is, he knows dang well he don't want to be on the receiving end of his own tactic. So that's going to be fun. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.